Welcome everyone to Rules Explained. In this episode, we're going over the game Ogre. I'm John Merritt,
No, I'm Rob Nothing.
and let's get rolling. In our last episode, we went over the map, we went over counters, and in this episode, we are going to go over the turn sequence and movement. So the turn sequence is kind of interesting. So there's turns in which the ogre seems to always go first. So the precise sequence for each turn depends upon the scenario being played. So I'm presuming that depending upon the scenario, these can change. Is that correct?
Well, if you have a traditional ogre versus defender game, that sequence that you see there, 4.02, would be the standard one.
Uh-huh.
However, as 4.03 suggests, there could be additional sequences for additional players who are defending. And if you got really creative, you'd have to go ahead and consider a non-ogre scenario in which you just have traditional units fighting traditional units. So you'd have to replace ogre moves and ogre fires with attacker moves and attacker fires. So yeah, there could be some minor variations.
So it reads, during his turn, each player may move any or all of his units and fire with any or all of them as long as each unit fires only once. And except for GEVs, ground effect vehicles, move only once.
Standard war game rules. This is a
Yep.
move fire standard war game scenario. In fact, I'm very surprised they don't have the standard rule that was in these games for a long time that movement points don't accumulate turn to turn.
That's
I
correct. They
thought that
do
was funny.
not. Yeah, and they had to put that in there. So
Yes.
the turn sequence for a basic and advanced scenario is the ogre moves first. Ogre moves first. Ogre fires first. The defender's armor units disabled the previous turn become undisabled. So a unit can either be active, disabled, or destroyed, basically, right?
That is correct.
There's
A
no hit
disabled
points,
unit,
nothing to keep track of.
no, there's no points to keep track of. There is a slight variation with the infantry units, which we can address during combat.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, the disabled function is basically like a stunned, if you wish. The game fiction assumes that the onboard computer systems would go ahead and keep the unit at a functioning level while the crew was healing themselves or perhaps rebooting an engine or whatever the case may be. And then the systems would reset and then the unit would be able to participate in combat again. But during that time period, it was immobile, not capable of firing any major weapon systems, and therefore very vulnerable. If you hit a unit, as we'll discuss during combat, that's disabled, you get another disabled result, it takes it out.
It's gone. And then the defender moves, the defender fires, and then the defender moves his GEVs a second time, which I thought was really interesting and makes for some really neat strategic play.
Mm-hmm.
Because I played the game a few times, and the ogre goes across the battlefield, and I found myself chasing it. Because, I have one target, and this target was faster than I was for whatever odd reason, or, because I was going through trees and stuff, and I could catch up to it. So I had to position myself where I thought he was going to be, or in the direction that he was going, so I could still fire at him.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of guessing, and I think he's going to go here, or he might go there, and I need to place my guys in a position in which I know he's coming towards. Because if he takes a sharp left, like they did in Mad Max, I don't know where he's going.
Mm-hmm.
So, multiplayer sequences. A scenario involving more than two players will use a sequence. The players move in the same order each turn. Each attacking player in turn moves and resolves combat. Then each defending player in turn moves and resolves their combat. Players on the same side may take their fire phase together to combine fire, which we will talk about later, what that means to combine fire. So that is the turn sequence. Ogre moves, ogre fires. The defender's units which are disabled become enabled. The defender moves, the defender fires, and then the defender moves his GEVs a second time.
Now consider this game: two ogres versus a regular defending force. You got yourself a really interesting scenario.
It is. So movement. Okay, so every piece, except I believe the howitzer and the command post, has a movement value. That's in the upper right corner. It's represented by an M and then a number. That's the number of hexes they can move.
Oh, I was just talking about this, and I thought this would not be present. There it is, John.
What's that?
Movement points may not be accumulated from turn
Yeah.
to turn. Oh, I was joking about that, and there it is.
Yeah. Oh, because you said that, and I went, oh, okay, you know this game better than I do, because I'd read that, and I said, that's funny. So a unit never has to move. A disabled unit may not move until it recovers. So this is the maximum amount of hexes they can move. Yeah, it cannot be accumulated. A disabled, blah, blah, blah. Stacking. A unit may not be stacked. That is, only one unit at a time may occupy each hex.
Now, this is a matter of contention for me. You got a hex that represents approximately 1 mile.
Yep.
And you're telling me that I can only put 1 GEV in that 1 mile space? Now, they could explain it through all sorts of game fiction, I guess, but it just makes no bloody sense to me
No,
to
it
be
doesn't.
able to do that.
I mean, I could maybe see 2 ogres not being able to take up 1 space.
Yeah.
Maybe. Stacking units, combining infantry. A basic infantry counter is a 3 counter squad, 2 or 3 1 squad counters, or 1 squad and 2 squad counters. Let me reread that because I really screwed that up. A basic infantry counter is the 3 squad counter, 2 or 3 1 squad counters, or a 1 squad and a 2 squad counter may occupy a hex together, since they are still equivalent to a 3 squad counter. So really what this is saying is you can only have a 3 squad counter on any hex at any given time.
Right. 3 points of infantry in 1 hex at any one time.
That's it. You can have a 2 squad counter and a 1 squad, but you can't have 2 3 squad counters on there.
Right. And here's the crazy thing. Depending on what fiction you read, a squad of infantry is 1 soldier in a power suit. And yeah, this guy's tough. I mean, for anybody who's familiar, and again, the introduction we talked about a couple of episodes ago does mention Heinlein Starship Troopers. Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating part of this game world, is that you got this 1 soldier with all this firepower and all this armor, which, by the way, there's actually a separate game called Battlesuit that simulates that man-to-man aspect rather than this armored aspect. But I digress. But I want to go back to the stacking issue here. I could have 1 squad, 1 man in that 1 mile hex, and for whatever reason, I can't put anything else in that area.
Yes. That 1 unit is taking up 1 mile of space.
Yeah, I'm flabbergasted.
Yeah, I know, it's
I
silly.
never understood that.
Yeah, I don't know. It must be in there for a tactical reason, I guess.
The only thing I can reasonably postulate is that they do this for the ease of gameplay, because if you start combining units together, then you have the problem of which unit am I targeting? Is there spillover fire? Is there any sort of collateral damage that's being suffered? And there's a lot of different things to consider, I suppose. If you just limit it to 1 unit per hex, you don't have to worry about all those things, and the game can be, 16 pages long instead of 32 pages long.
Right. So that's combining infantry, and we have a very cool picture of a GEV. It looks like a hovercraft with guns on it.
I want one.
I won't. I can get to work real easy in one of those.
Yeah, I think so.
Moving through other units. Any unit may move through a hex occupied by a friendly unit as long as the 2 do not end up on the same hex. No unit may move through a hex occupied by an enemy unit except as described under section 5.03, ramming, which we will talk about shortly. Next. It's the next one. So there's 5022 and then 503. That's funny the way they labeled these.
Well, it's intuitive. It's almost like the Dewey Decimal System in a way.
Yeah.
So
So
you
anyway,
go, yeah. Oh, it works out pretty well. But you're right. The numbers are all over the place.
so any unit may move through a hex occupied by a friendly unit, no problem, but you cannot go through an enemy hex. So you're
Unless you're
one
running them
man.
over.
So you have one guy with one infantry with one power suit on, and you can't get past him.
Unless you're running them over, and that's basically what ramming is.
Ramming. It's a
Yep.
good day to die. Or live. There's always that option. Now, an ogre may damage or destroy enemy armor units by ramming. Ramming a unit's is accomplished by moving onto or through its hex, and we'll talk about the actual. Oh, I guess we're going to talk about it now. In section 5.031, which is the very next one, any immobilized armor unit, a howitzer, for example, is just destroyed. So if a ogre rams into a howitzer, it's just destroyed. Any armor unit rammed is disabled on a die roll of 1 to 3 and is destroyed on a 4 through 6. So if I have my GEV, I get hit by the ogre, he rams it or goes through the hex. I roll a d6 on a 1 through 3, it is destroyed. I'm sorry, disabled.
Stable.
On a 4 through 6, it is destroyed. The ogre player rolls the die immediately upon ramming. If the armor unit is only disabled, the ogre may expend one more movement point in the same hex to ram it again.
Back it up.
Rams it, puts it in reverse, rams it again. An ogre loses 2 tread points for ramming a heavy tank and 1 tread for ramming any other armor unit. So that's going to play into effect as well. I do like the way they did that. I mean, it's also going to damage the ogre as well, and the ogre only has so many tread points available to him.
It's nothing you want to do lightly, but if you find yourself being a little overwhelmed with targets and you don't have enough weapons, it is probably the most efficient way to try to get rid of the enemy, especially if you're just being surrounded by a bunch of light armor units.
So movement after ramming. If an ogre still has movement left after ramming, it may continue to move. However, if loss of tread due to the ram reduces the ogre's movement points, it may move only to the reduced number of hexes that turn. So losing movement is immediate. It's not when the turn ends. I mean, as he's taking tread points, his movement is reduced immediately. Ramming CPs, these are command posts. An ogre may ram a command post, destroying it. Since the command post has no defense strength, the ogre's unhurt. Okay. That's what I was thinking about next is, a command post. What about a howitzer? I mean, it doesn't have any defense. Or does it?
If you yes, it does. But if you
Oh, it
read
does,
the
okay.
rules, yeah, if you read the rules as is, yes, if you ran over a howitzer, you lose a tread unit.
Okay. Ogres ramming ogres.
Yes.
In scenarios with several ogres, one ogre may ram another by moving into its hex. The ramming ogre then immediately ends its movement for that turn in the last hex it occupied before ramming. An ogre which rams a larger ogre loses 5 tread units. An ogre which rams a smaller ogre or one of the same size, so equal to or less, loses 3 treads. The damage done to the ogre which was rammed is determined by a die roll. The ramming player rolls 2 dice. If his ramming ogre is a Mark 3, and 4 dice. If his ramming ogre is a Mark 5. So if it's a Mark 3, you roll 3 dice. Mark 5, you roll, 4? 2 dice, I'm sorry. If it's a Mark 3, you roll 2 dice. If it's a Mark 5, you roll 3 dice. The total number of dice equals the number of treads lost by the ogre which was rammed. Wow. They really go after the treads, don't they?
Yes. And it's a scenario, it's a situation I don't ever recall ever happening. An ogre ramming an ogre, but it could happen if you want to have an ogre duel, or if you have a scenario in which there's a smaller ogre with an accompanying defensive force trying to defend itself against maybe two other ogres. That's what I was mentioning earlier. Is when you
Mm-hmm.
get these multiplayer games, if you have like a small ogre defending with some armor and infantry against two really large ogres, that could be a very interesting and fairly long scenario for an ogre game. I mean, we're talking about, hold on to your hats, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour and a half game.
This is interesting. Limits on ramming. An ogre may ram no more than twice per turn, or one enemy ogre per turn. I guess that stops the person from just going there and just running over your opponent.
Yes. I love the next rule.
Armor units ramming ogres. An armor unit may ram an ogre by moving into its hex. The ogre loses one tread unit automatically.
Well,
The armor unit is destroyed.
there you
I
go.
was ramming speed.
Well,
All right.
there are tactical situations where this would make sense.
Uh-huh.
If you had an ogre that was one tread unit shy of being reduced to the next movement, especially if it was going to be reduced to an immobile situation, why not sacrifice the armor unit to slow it down without any die roll, without any need for consulting a chart? You just throw it at it and say, love you, mom, and then the ram exploding tank, and then you go ahead and just
Suicide run.
slow down the ogre.
It is a good day to die.
It is.
Wow, that's true. I could see that being a good a tactic. All right. Infantry, armor units ramming each other, or infantry. Why don't you go over that?
Well, this is just like the game here suggests, it's not covered in this version of the game, but there is a concept called Overrun. And that's when a unit moves into a hex occupied by another unit. You might call it close combat maybe in another game. But needless to say, close combat in a 1 mile large hex is maybe a relative concept. But in essence, now you're within point blank range for the weapons of the day, and you're going to try to slug it out. And infantry actually get a little tougher, if I remember correctly, and even disabled units can fight back to a certain degree. So infantry overruns and armor overruns become a very neat part of the game, which just kind of deviates from this typical move fire sequence.
So if an ogre goes through a hex with an infantry value, and the ogre has anti-personnel weapons left, the infantry unit is automatically reduced by 1 strength point.
Yes.
And does that mean if I have a infantry unit of 3, it goes down to a 2?
Yep.
And if I have 2, it goes down to 1. If it's a 1, it's just destroyed.
Yep.
Simple and clean.
Yep.
The ogre may choose to expand another movement point, and once again, reduce the infantry strength by 1. So he runs over the infantryman, puts it in reverse, runs over the other guy.
I just hope he has the required backup, warning signals to go ahead and make sure the infantry knows it's coming.
And don't worry, the ogre didn't feel a thing. All right, and this part I thought...
You know what?
What's that?
I want to interrupt there. You just said something very fascinating, just from the game fiction standpoint. The game fiction assumes that the ogre are run by cybernetic brains, essentially massive AI complexes buried deep within, several meters of BPC armor.
Uh-huh.
Now, if you were designing one of these things, would you design them with some sort of pain receptors just so the ogre brain would understand what was happening to it? Or would you just rely on simple, analog or binary, readouts, which would be more effective to let the ogre brain, an AI brain, know that it was perhaps in trouble?
Is it sentient?
Yes.
Pain.
That's what I was thinking.
Definitely.
Do you want to put... Go ahead, sorry.
No, just definitely, because the pain is remembered long after the pleasure is forgotten.
Yeah.
And it gives it I would think, fictionally, I think it would give it a sense of self-preservation as well. I'm being hit here. I need to protect myself here.
Yeah. Rather than just a simple, series of programmed codes, this thing is thinking, ouch, that hurt. I need to react to that.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting thought. I hope, if nothing else, this gets a whole bunch of people to respond as far as what they think. do you need to have, and this could apply to just about any situation where you're involving AI cybernetic organisms, do you want to have pain receptors in order to go ahead and increase its possibility and its chances of preserving itself?
That's a good question. So the GEV double movements. So at this point, the GEV, was a general effective vehicle,
No,
ground
ground
effective
effect
vehicle.
vehicle.
That's right. Ground effective vehicle moves twice per turn, before combat and then after combat. Why did they
Run,
do
buddy.
this? Oh, am I? Oh, GV may move twice per turn, once up to 4 hexes before combat, when all other units move, and once up to 3 hexes after combat.
Yep, it's a hit and run. You get in
Okay,
there,
hit and
shoot,
run.
and you get out.
Ogre movement points, and Ogre begins the game with 3 movement points. This may be reduced by damage to its treads units. This may be reduced by damage to its tread units as the game progresses.
Do you want to scroll down to the Ogre record sheet so we can show what that means?
Yeah,
Thank you.
good idea. So
Love
here's a
the
Mark 5.
illustration. So yes, so each one of those O's represents a tread unit. So as you lose them through, running over poor infantry, or I should say poor armor units, or you're hitting other ogres, or you're being attacked, you scratch off each one of those on a piece of paper. And when you lose that entire row, your movement drops down, as you can see.
Yeah, so it looks like every 20 points of tread damage you take, it reduces the movement value by 1.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes from 2 to 1, then to 0. You're not moving anywhere.
Right.
We also found a nice picture that people can see, so they can see the actual scale of what an ogre looks like. So in the lower right corner here, there's a man standing next to an M1 Abram, standing next to an Ogre Mark III, and then an Ogre Mark V. I mean, that is a pretty big tank.
Yes. Now, for those of you, we'll go over this a little bit more, but you can see at the back of the Ogre, we have 6 missile launchers, and one of them appears to be empty at this moment. You can see 6 secondary batteries. Those are long, spiny-looking things coming out of either side of the Ogre. In the front, you have 2 primary weapon systems, and then you have an assortment of little bulbs on the sides. Those are your anti-personnel. They're on the sides and at the rear. There's 3 at the rear, and then there's 4 each side. Those are, multi-positional devices that can fire in basically almost any direction. And then people usually ask who are not familiar, well, what's the deal with the conning tower? Well, that's basically the sensor array of the Ogre. And for those people who are probably asking, wait a minute, why don't we just shoot at the sensor array and disable the Ogre that way? Well, absolutely, that would make realistic sense, but in the game that is not an option, because the fiction doesn't allow for it, 1, and 2, the Ogre is designed to look fearsome. It's not designed to be an actual weapon system that would actually be capable of doing what we're suggesting, but it just looks great. And as a very famous person once said, it's better to look good than to feel good.
And I think on that note, I think that's going to wrap up this episode. Would like to thank Ethan for the music. And as always, if you have questions, comments, we would love to hear from you at rulesexplained@gmail.com. You can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify Podcast, Google Podcast, any podcast we can think of. We're hopefully there. If not, let us know. You can find us on YouTube at Rules Explained. I'm John Merritt.
I'm Rob Nothing.
Guys, thank you for listening.
Adios.